The moment Elizabeth learned her uncle had abandoned the throne, she did not cry. She simply stopped breathing. It was December 1936, and in the drawing room of 145 Piccadilly, a 10-year-old girl watched her father's hands tremble as he held the abdication document, and in that suffocating silence, she understood that her childhood had just been murdered by a man who chose love over duty. Could a child that young truly comprehend what it meant to become the future queen? Or was she simply watching her father break apart, piece by piece, unable to do anything but stand perfectly still? The fire crackled in the hearth, but the room felt cold. Her mother sat rigid on the sofa, her face a porcelain mask that threatened to shatter. Margaret, only 6, played with a doll on the carpet, oblivious to the earthquake reshaping their lives. Elizabeth's patent leather shoes reflected the firelight, and she stared at them, focusing on that small, controllable detail while everything else spun into chaos. Her father, who stammered, who never wanted this burden, who found comfort in naval uniforms and quiet routines, was now King George VI, and she, Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, was now heir presumptive. How does a girl reconcile the person she was at breakfast with the person she must become by dinner? Outside, London hummed with gossip and scandal. Edward V, the Golden Prince who danced and smiled and charmed, had chosen Wallis Simpson over an empire. The newspapers screamed headlines that Elizabeth wasn't allowed to read, but she heard the servants whispering, heard the word, American, spoken like a curse, heard twice divorced, murmured with scandalized delight. The adults tried to shield her, but children absorb everything. The tension in shoulders, the pauses before answers, the way her governess Marion Crawford suddenly looked at her differently, with something that resembled pity mixed with awe. What did it feel like to be studied like a specimen under glass, to have adults suddenly measure every word spoken in her presence? Her father didn't speak for hours after the announcement. He sat in his study, and Elizabeth stood outside the door, her hand raised to knock, but never actually knocking. She could hear nothing from within. No sobbing, no rage, just an oppressive silence that felt more frightening than any outburst. Her mother finally emerged and gently guided her away, but not before Elizabeth glimpsed her father's face through the crack in the door, ashen, lost, terrified. He looked like a man drowning. How could she, a child who still played with her corgis and collected horse figurines, possibly help him when she was drowning too? The weight of it pressed on her chest at night. She lay in bed, Margaret sleeping peacefully beside her, and traced the crown molding on the ceiling with her eyes, following the elaborate patterns round and round until her head spun. The house staff had begun treating her differently, deeper curtsies, longer pauses, a certain carefulness in their voices. Mrs. Knight, her nanny, watched her with worried eyes during lessons. Even Crawford seemed unsure how to proceed, balancing arithmetic with the unspoken knowledge that this girl would someday rule. Did Elizabeth resent her uncle in those dark hours, or did she simply feel the crushing inevitability of a fate she couldn't escape? Christmas that year tasted like ashes. They went through the motions, the tree, the presents, the traditional meal, but joy had evacuated the premises. Her father attempted smiles that never reached his eyes. Her mother orchestrated perfection with the desperation of someone trying to hold back a flood with her bare hands. Elizabeth received a beautiful dollhouse, intricately detailed, perfect in every way, and she thanked everyone politely while thinking that dollhouses were for children, and she wasn't allowed to be a child anymore. Margaret laughed and played, still innocent, still free, and Elizabeth felt the distance between them widen like a chasm. What does it do to a sister's heart to realize she can never fully share her burden with the person closest to her? The training began subtly. Constitutional history suddenly dominated her studies. She learned about monarchs who succeeded, who failed, who were beheaded, who were beloved. Crawford taught her about Parliament, about the delicate balance between crown and government, about duty and sacrifice and service. The word, sacrifice, kept appearing, spoken reverently, as if it were something noble rather than something that slowly carved pieces out of a person's soul. Elizabeth absorbed it all, memorizing, understanding, preparing. But at night, she still wanted to be just Lilibet, the girl who loved horses and giggled with her sister. Could those two versions of herself coexist, or would one inevitably consume the other? Her father's coronation approached with the inexorable momentum of a funeral procession. The palace buzzed with preparations. Tailors, jewelers, rehearsals, endless lists. Elizabeth watched fittings for robes she would someday wear, saw the crown her father would place on his head, the crown that represented everything he never wanted and everything he now had no choice but to accept. She saw him practice his speech, struggling with the words, his stammer worsening under stress, his face flushed with frustration and shame. Her mother stood beside him, patient and strong, but even she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. How does a child process watching her parents forced into roles they despise by circumstances beyond anyone's control? The night before the coronation, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She wandered the corridors of Buckingham Palace, their new prison, though no one called it that. The portraits of dead monarchs watched her with painted eyes: Victoria, Edward VI, George V. Generations of people who wore the crown and carried its weight until it crushed them or transformed them, or both. She stopped before a painting of Queen Victoria as a young woman, before Albert's death, before decades of mourning, when her eyes still held something like hope. Elizabeth searched that painted face for answers, for some secret knowledge about how to survive what was coming. Did Victoria ever want to be just a girl again, or did the crown erase that possibility entirely? The coronation itself blurred into a dream of gold and incense and endless ritual. Elizabeth sat with Margaret in the abbey, wearing matching lace and watching their father transformed. When they placed the crown on his head, she saw him flinch, just slightly, just for a moment, and then his face became a mask, royal and remote. Her mother became queen consort, draped in ermine and jewels, beautiful and untouchable. Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, a kind of hardening, a recognition that this was her future, to put on the mask, to carry the weight, to become someone else entirely. Was there any way to prepare for that transformation, or did it simply happen, slowly, like erosion wearing away stone? School became impossible. Other children existed in a different world, one Elizabeth could observe but never truly enter. She attended classes with a small group of carefully selected girls, daughters of nobility, vetted and approved. But even among them, she stood apart. They could dream of marriage, of careers, of choices. Elizabeth's path was carved in stone before she was born, and her uncle's abdication had simply made it visible. The other girls were kind, mostly, but kindness built walls as surely as cruelty when it came wrapped in deference and distance. What does it feel like to be surrounded by people and still completely alone? The smell of chalk dust and old books filled the schoolroom at the palace, but it couldn't make the space feel like a real classroom. Outside those windows, normal children walked to normal schools, complained about normal homework, dreamed normal dreams. Elizabeth conjugated French verbs and studied constitutional law while other 11-year-olds played hopscotch and traded sweets. Her governess praised her diligence, her focus, her maturity. But maturity was just another word for the slow death of childhood. She learned to curtsy perfectly, to speak with measured precision, to never show surprise or displeasure or spontaneous joy. Every gesture was calibrated, every word weighed, every expression controlled. What happens to the authentic self when performance becomes permanent? Her relationship with Margaret became complicated by unspoken truths. Margaret could misbehave, could be charming and wild and careless. Margaret could throw tantrums and slam doors and say inappropriate things because Margaret was the spare, not the heir. Elizabeth watched her sister's freedom with something that wasn't quite envy, but wasn't quite acceptance either. She loved Margaret fiercely, but that love now carried the weight of responsibility, protecting her, guiding her, being the example. When Margaret asked why Elizabeth had to be so serious all the time, how could she explain that seriousness wasn't a choice but a requirement, an armor she wore to survive what was coming? The sound of her father coughing echoed through the palace corridors, even in those early years. The stress manifested physically. The smoking increased, the exhaustion deepened, the weight of unwanted duty pressed on his lungs. Elizabeth heard him at night sometimes, hacking in his study, trying to muffle the sound so as not to worry anyone. But she worried anyway. She worried constantly. Every cough was a reminder of the countdown. Every tired expression on his face was a preview of her future. She was 12, 13, 14, watching her father slowly consumed by a role he never wanted, knowing that same role waited for her with infinite patience. How does a child bear that knowledge without breaking? The war arrived like a long-expected nightmare finally materializing. September 1939, and suddenly the abstract concept of duty became concrete, immediate, dangerous. Her parents refused to evacuate, refused to send her and Margaret to safety in Canada or the countryside. They would stay visible, present, sharing the danger with their people. Elizabeth understood the symbolism, understood the necessity, but she also understood that her parents were using her and Margaret as symbols too. They were props in a performance of British resilience, little girls whose presence said, "We're all in this together." Was there nobility in that, or was it just another form of sacrifice demanded without consent? The bombing began, and London burned. Elizabeth lay in bed at Windsor Castle, hearing distant thunder that wasn't thunder, seeing the sky glow orange with fires consuming the city. The next morning, she would read casualty reports, learn about homes destroyed, families killed, history erased in single nights. She volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service when she was old enough, insisted on contributing, wore a uniform that made her look almost like everyone else. In the motor pool, covered in grease, hands blistered from work, she felt momentarily human. The other women treated her carefully at first, but gradually, imperceptibly, some barrier dissolved. They laughed together, swore together, complained about their work together. Could she remain that person, or would the crown eventually demand she surrender even this small taste of normalcy? Philip appeared in her life like a comet, bright, dangerous, impossible to ignore. She was 13 when something shifted in how she saw him at Britannia Royal Naval College. He was 18, tall, impossibly handsome, confident in a way that bordered on arrogance. He was royal enough to be acceptable. Greek and Danish blood, connections to every throne in Europe, but poor enough to be hungry for something beyond inherited privilege. He looked at her not with deference but with interest. Genuine interest in the girl rather than worship of the princess. That look burned itself into her soul and refused to be extinguished. But could love survive the pressure of monarchy, or would duty eventually suffocate every authentic emotion? Their courtship happened in stolen moments and carefully worded letters. Philip served in the Navy during the war, and Elizabeth treasured every communication. Read and reread his words until the paper wore thin. He was irreverent, funny, sometimes inappropriate. Everything her constrained existence wasn't. Her parents approved but worried. Her father especially seemed conflicted, wanting his daughter's happiness but understanding the complications, the compromises, the ways Philip would have to reshape himself to fit the mold of royal consort. Philip would have to abandon his naval career, surrender his Greek and Danish titles, become something he wasn't. What does it do to a man to be required to make himself smaller so his wife can be larger? The engagement photograph captured something that would never quite exist again. Elizabeth at 20, genuinely smiling, Philip beside her looking proud and slightly mischievous. In that frozen moment, they were just a young couple in love, planning a future. But the future waiting for them was already written, already predetermined, already shaped by forces neither could control. The wedding in November 1947 was magnificent. Abbey bells and crowds lining the streets and 8 bridesmaids in a dress decorated with seed pearls and crystal. Britain was still under rationing, still recovering from war, and the wedding was a gift to a weary nation, a moment of beauty in grim times. But was it also a transaction, a young woman's happiness offered up as public spectacle in exchange for national morale? They tried for normalcy afterward. Philip returned to naval service, stationed in Malta, and for a brief, shining window, Elizabeth was almost an ordinary officer's wife. She shopped in local markets, attended parties at the naval base, played games, laughed freely. The Mediterranean sun warmed her face, and she felt young in a way she hadn't since childhood. She gave birth to Charles, then Anne, and experienced motherhood in those stolen moments between royal duties. But even in Malta, even in those precious borrowed days, the red boxes followed her. Government papers requiring attention, constitutional matters demanding decision. The umbilical cord connecting her to Britain never truly stretched far enough to allow real freedom. How much can a person treasure happiness when she knows it's temporary? When the countdown ticks audibly in every quiet moment. Her father's health deteriorated with the steady, inevitable progression of a tragedy foretold. The cancer in his lung, though they didn't call it that publicly, didn't speak the word, maintained the fiction of pulmonary issues, consumed him from within. Elizabeth watched him fade, watched the life drain from his eyes, even as he continued performing his duties with stubborn, heartbreaking dignity. He appeared at public events, waved to crowds, delivered speeches, and she could see the effort it cost him, the pain he suppressed, the exhaustion he refused to acknowledge. She was 25 when she realized her father was dying, 25 when the countdown became impossible to ignore. What does a daughter feel watching her father destroyed by a role she knows she must inherit? The tour to Kenya in February 1952 was supposed to be a respite, a brief escape before the inevitable. Elizabeth and Philip visited Treetops, a hotel built in the branches of a massive fig tree overlooking a waterhole. They watched elephants and rhinos, photographed wildlife, pretended to be tourists. The air smelled of earth and wild things, and for a few hours, she was just a woman on holiday with her husband, far from protocol and duty and the suffocating expectations of monarchy. She went to sleep that night still Princess Elizabeth, still heir, still waiting. She woke up queen. Her father had died in his sleep at Sandringham, and the news took hours to reach Kenya, and in those hours, she ruled Britain without knowing it. How does it feel to become a different person while unconscious, to wake up transformed by events beyond your control? The journey home happened in a fog. Someone had packed mourning clothes, black dress, black hat, black gloves, anticipating this moment, preparing for tragedy with the grim practicality of royal life. She changed on the plane, shedding the bright colors of holiday for the darkness of grief and duty. Philip sat beside her silent, his face showing something she'd rarely seen: fear. Not fear of responsibility or public life, but fear of what this meant for her, for them, for the life they'd barely begun to build. He reached for her hand, and she let him hold it, and in that gesture was an entire conversation about loss and love, and the impossible future stretching before them. What words could possibly capture the moment when everything changes and nothing can ever be changed back? London greeted her with gray skies and solemn faces. She descended from the aircraft at Heathrow, and the Prime Minister Churchill stood waiting, tears streaming down his weathered face. And she was 25 years old and Queen of the United Kingdom and head of the Commonwealth and defender of the faith, and she felt like a child playing dress up in borrowed clothes. The girl who boarded that plane in Kenya ceased to exist somewhere over the Mediterranean, dissolved into air and memory, replaced by this new creature, Elizabeth Regina. But who was this new Elizabeth, and where did the old one go? And could any part of that earlier, happier, freer self survive the transformation? The months between her father's death and her coronation stretched like a prison sentence. She moved into Buckingham Palace, that vast, cold museum of a building, and began the work of being queen. Prime Minister meetings every Tuesday, audiences with ambassadors, official papers, constitutional duties. The endless machinery of monarchy grinding forward regardless of grief or uncertainty or the desperate wish to simply pause and breathe. Churchill treated her with grandfatherly affection, but also with the weight of history, reminding her constantly of her duty, her role, her importance to Britain and the Commonwealth. She was the symbol of continuity, the living embodiment of British identity, the anchor in a rapidly changing world. But what happens when the symbol is also a human being who wants to grieve her father without performing grief for public consumption? The coronation preparations consumed the palace. Every detail scrutinized, every second choreographed, every gesture rehearsed until it became muscle memory. Elizabeth practiced walking in the heavy robes, practiced balancing the crown, practiced the solemn expressions required for each ritual moment. The Archbishop of Canterbury coached her on the religious significance, the sacred nature of the ceremony, the divine right being conferred. But it felt less like divinity and more like theater. an elaborate performance for cameras and crowds and history. The coronation would be televised, a first, a modern innovation, a decision that filled traditionalists with horror and progressives with excitement. Millions would watch her transformation from woman to monarch, would witness the exact moment the crown touched her head and changed everything. Could anyone watching understand what it felt like from inside that performance? June 2, 1953, dawned grey and drizzly, typical British weather refusing to cooperate with historical significance. Elizabeth woke before dawn, her stomach tight with nerves she couldn't show, fear she couldn't voice, doubt she couldn't acknowledge. Her dressers arrived, began the long process of transformation. Undergarments, stockings, the white silk dress, the purple velvet robe, the jewelry. The careful arrangement of hair to support the coming weight. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger regal, composed, perfect, empty. Where was Lilibet in this reflection? Where was the girl who loved horses and dreamed of ordinary happiness? Had she finally been completely erased, or was she hiding somewhere beneath the costume, waiting for a moment to breathe? The procession to Westminster Abbey took hours. The golden coach swayed and lurched, and Elizabeth sat rigidly upright, waving to crowds that lined every street, that pressed against barriers, that climbed lampposts and stood on rooftops for a glimpse of history. The roar of their cheering penetrated the coach walls, a sound like an ocean, like a living thing that demanded feeding. They wanted her, not Elizabeth the person, but Elizabeth the symbol, the queen, the fairy tale made manifest. She smiled and waved and performed the role even as something inside her wondered if anyone in those crowds understood what they were asking of her. Did they know they were watching a woman disappear into an idea? Inside the abbey, the ancient stones held the weight of centuries. Every monarch since William the Conqueror had been crowned here, had spoken these same vows, had felt this same crushing weight. The ceremony unfolded with ritualistic precision, the anointing with holy oil, hidden beneath a golden canopy because some moments are too sacred for cameras. The moment she felt the oil cold against her skin and thought about how many other foreheads had felt this same touch. The archbishop presented the regalia, sword, orb, scepter, each object heavy with symbolism and literal weight. And then the crown, St. Edward's crown, solid gold, 4 pounds of history and expectation and duty. When they placed it on her head, she felt her neck compress, her shoulders tighten, her whole body brace against the weight. This was the crown her father had worn, the crown that had slowly killed him. How long would it take to kill her? The vows spoken in that moment were absolute. She promised to govern according to law and justice, to maintain the Protestant religion, to serve her people with every breath until her last breath. The words echoed in the abbey's vaulted ceiling, bounced off stone walls, were transmitted to millions of television viewers, were recorded for history. There was no escape clause, no possibility of abdication without destroying everything her father had rebuilt after Edward's betrayal. She was bound, absolutely and permanently, to this role. As the congregation sang the anthem, as the peers paid homage, as the world watched her transformation, did anyone else feel the cage closing, or was she alone in understanding the true price of the crown? The years that followed telescoped together in a blur of duty and protocol. Prime ministers came and went, Churchill's grandfatherly wisdom giving way to Eden's brittle pride, then Macmillan's unflappable pragmatism, then Wilson's northern directness, then Heath, then Wilson again, then Callaghan, then Thatcher's revolutionary fervor. She met with each of them weekly, advised and was consulted, maintained the constitutional balance between crown and government. She learned to keep her opinions private, her politics invisible, her personal views locked away where they couldn't interfere with her role as constitutional monarch. But what happens to strongly held beliefs when they can never be expressed? Do they atrophy, or do they fester, or do they simply become another part of the self that must be sacrificed? Her children grew up in an environment that was neither normal nor entirely royal. Charles, sensitive and uncertain, crushed by expectations he couldn't meet. Anne, tough and capable, the one who seemed to actually understand duty without resenting it. Andrew and Edward, the younger sons, given slightly more freedom but still trapped in the gravitational pull of monarchy. Elizabeth tried to be a good mother, but but duty constantly intervened. Tours that lasted months, official functions that consumed evenings, the endless red boxes that demanded attention even when her children needed her. She missed first words, first steps, school plays, sports days, the 1,000 tiny moments that constitute childhood. Mary Poppins premiered, and Elizabeth watched it with a strange recognition. Here was a nanny who appeared magically to raise children while their parents were consumed by other concerns. Was she really so different from Mr. Banks, prioritizing work over presence, duty over relationship? Philip chafed against the constraints like a caged lion. He had given up his naval career, surrendered his birth titles, walked 2 steps behind his wife at every public appearance. He created roles for himself, modernizing palace management, supporting scientific and environmental causes, traveling to obscure corners of the Commonwealth, but none of it truly compensated for what he'd lost. Their marriage became a private negotiation conducted in the gaps between public performance. They learned to communicate in glances and brief comments, to find connection in rare private moments, to maintain the appearance of partnership while living increasingly separate lives. When rumors of his affairs surfaced, she never publicly acknowledged them, never let the mask slip. But late at night, alone in her bedroom with only her corgis for company, did she allow herself to feel the betrayal, or had she trained herself not to feel anything that might interfere with duty? The crisis came in waves. The Suez disaster that humiliated Britain on the world stage, the slow dissolution of the empire, colonies demanding independence, the Commonwealth reshaping itself into something new, the IRA bombing campaigns that brought terrorism to British soil, the economic catastrophes of the 70s, the strikes and blackouts and national malaise, the Falklands War that made Thatcher a hero and divided the nation. Each crisis demanded her presence, her steadiness, her role as the unchanging anchor in turbulent seas. She performed that role perfectly, never wavering, never showing doubt. But the weight accumulated, pressing down on her shoulders, grinding her bones, stealing her breath. How many crises can one person absorb before the person dissolves entirely into the role? The moment that defined everything came not in triumph but in isolation. It wasn't the coronation or the jubilees or the public celebrations. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening, deep into her reign, sitting alone in her study at Windsor Castle. The red boxes sat on her desk, endless papers requiring attention, decisions, signatures. The room smelled of old leather and furniture polish, and the faint lingering scent of her father's pipe tobacco, though he'd been dead for decades. Outside, the world continued without her. Her children had their own troubled lives. Charles's miserable marriage to Diana, Anne's divorce, Andrew's questionable associations, Edward's attempts to forge an identity outside royal duty. The palace staff moved through distant corridors. Security patrols walked the grounds. And she sat alone with her papers and her duty, and the crushing awareness that this was her life, had always been her life, would be her life until death released her from the vow she'd made in the Abbey all those years ago. What had it all been for? She thought about her uncle sometimes, the man who had cursed her with this burden by choosing love over duty. Edward had lived in exile, died in Paris, spent decades with Wallis, the woman for whom he'd surrendered an empire. He'd been vilified, yes, but he'd been free. He'd made a choice and lived with its consequences. Elizabeth had made no choice. Choice had been stolen from her by his abdication, by her father's death, by the machinery of succession that ground forward regardless of individual will or desire. She had done everything right, everything expected, everything required. She had sacrificed childhood and privacy and authentic emotion and the possibility of ordinary happiness. She had given 70 years to duty, had subsumed every personal desire to the demands of crown and constitution. And sitting in that study, looking at her reflection in the darkened window, an old woman in pearls, impeccably groomed, perfectly composed, utterly alone, she finally allowed herself to ask the forbidden question. Had it been worth it? The reflection offered no answer. It simply stared back as it had for decades, showing her what she had become: the longest reigning monarch in British history, the most recognizable woman in the world, the living embodiment of continuity and tradition and service. Her face was on stamps and coins and currency throughout the Commonwealth. Her image hung in government buildings and schools and homes across the globe. She was immortalized in portraits and photographs and films and endless commentary. But who was the person behind that image? After 70 years of performance, after 7 decades of sublimating self to duty, after a lifetime of being Elizabeth Regina instead of simply Elizabeth, was there anything left of the girl who had once dreamed of being ordinary? The night sounds of Windsor surrounded her, ancient stones settling, guards changing, the distant hum of modern life kept carefully at bay by walls and protocol and centuries of tradition. Somewhere in the castle, staff prepared for tomorrow's obligations. Somewhere in London, the newspapers were already printing tomorrow's headlines, probably mentioning her in some capacity, because she was always news, always relevant, always watched. Somewhere in the world, people were being born who would live their entire lives under her reign, who would never know Britain without Elizabeth II, who would assume she had always been queen, and perhaps would always be queen, immortal and unchanging. But she was not immortal. She was human, despite the performance, despite the crown, despite everything. She was 80, 90, ancient, and still the duty continued. Still the red boxes arrived. Still the performance demanded continuation. When would it end? When could it end? Was death the only release from the vow she'd made at 27? The only escape from the cage she'd entered that rainy June morning in Westminster Abbey? She looked again at her reflection, searching for some trace of the 10-year-old girl who had watched her father's hands tremble in the drawing room at 145 Piccadilly. That girl had been frightened but curious, burdened but not yet crushed, aware of what was coming but not yet consumed by it. Where had that girl gone? Had she died in increments, piece by piece, as duty carved away everything authentic? Or was she still there somewhere, buried beneath layers of performance and protocol and perfect composure, waiting for a moment that would never come to finally emerge and simply be? After all the sacrifice, all the service, all the years of putting crown before self, had anyone ever seen the real Elizabeth? Or had she become so skilled at the performance that she'd forgotten who she was performing? The clock struck 10, its chime echoing through Windsor's ancient halls. Tomorrow would bring more boxes, more audiences, more duties. The machinery of monarchy would continue its grinding forward motion, indifferent to her fatigue or her questions or her late night moments of doubt. She would wake, dress in clothes chosen by others, appear at events planned by others, speak words written by others, perform the role she'd been performing for 70 years, and she would do it perfectly, because she always did it perfectly, because perfection was the only option, because the alternative, failure, breakdown, admission that the weight was too heavy, was unthinkable. So she would continue day after day, year after year, until the end. But sitting in that study, surrounded by the accumulated weight of 7 decades of duty, she finally understood the truth her father had known, the truth that had slowly killed him. The crown didn't elevate the wearer. It simply made them visible while they slowly disappeared. And now, at the end of everything, with the performance still demanding continuation, with no escape and no relief and no possibility of laying down the burden, was there any part of the real Elizabeth left to save, or had duty finally completed its slow work of erasure?